The day my grandmother's will was read aloud in her lawyer's oak-paneled office, my aunt stood up, pointed her finger directly at my face, and called me a thief in front of everyone. She said I had manipulated a dying old woman, forged signatures, and stolen what rightfully belonged to the whole family. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that my grandmother had installed a small, motion-activated camera in the corner of her study 6 months before she passed, and every single visit my aunt had paid to that house in those final weeks had been recorded in full. Every whispered conversation, every open drawer, every document slipped into a handbag. I had no idea the camera existed until the lawyer cleared his throat, set down the document he'd been reading, and said very quietly that before we proceeded any further, there was something we all needed to watch. My aunt's face went the color of old wax, and in that moment I understood that my grandmother had known exactly what was happening, had said nothing, and had prepared everything. She had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone in that room. She had been 3 steps ahead of me, too. My name is Clara Whitmore, and I am 36 years old. For most of my adult life, I have worked as a landscape architect, a job that requires a particular kind of patience, the ability to look at a patch of barren, difficult ground and imagine what it might become, given time, care, and the right conditions. I think my grandmother was the person who taught me that. She was a woman named Evelyn, and she had been tending her own garden in the same Sussex village for 53 years when she died. And the roses along the south wall of her cottage were so extraordinary that people genuinely slowed their cars on the lane outside just to look at them. She had planted them the year she married my grandfather, and she had fed and shaped them every summer since. And when he died, she kept tending them, because she said it was the only way she knew how to keep talking to him. I had spent more time in that cottage than almost anywhere else in my life. My parents divorced when I was 9, and every school holiday without exception, I was delivered to Evelyn's door with a single suitcase and the particular anxiety of a child who knows that the adults around her are conducting a war she's not allowed to understand. My grandmother never asked questions about the war. She handed me a mug of hot chocolate, showed me which drawer had the biscuits, and took me outside to do something useful with my hands. She taught me to prune. She taught me to read soil. She taught me that the most important thing about any growing thing is what is happening underground, where you cannot see it. I have thought about that lesson a great deal in the past year. My mother was Evelyn's younger daughter. My Aunt Patricia was the elder, and the two of them had conducted their own quieter, longer war for as long as anyone could remember, though the surface of their relationship was always maintained with the particular British politeness that makes it impossible for outsiders to understand that anything is wrong. There were birthday cards. There were Christmas lunches. There were phone calls that lasted exactly long enough to confirm that the relationship was still technically operational. Underneath, there was a bone-deep competition over everything: husbands, houses, children's achievements, and most pointedly, my grandmother's attention and approval. Patricia had always believed she was owed more. She had stayed local. She had visited regularly. She had sat with Evelyn through 2 hip operations and a bout of shingles, and she had never let anyone forget any of it. I want to be fair to Patricia. I want to describe her accurately rather than as a cartoon villain, because the truth is more complicated and therefore more painful. She was a woman in her early 60s who had made the particular sacrifice of staying close to home and who had watched her younger sister move to London, build a career, and largely absent herself from the difficult daily work of being a nearby daughter. My mother was not a bad person. She was simply someone who had decided that her own life came first, and she had paid for that decision in 1,000 small ways that I only began to understand when I was older. Patricia had paid for it too, in ways that were different but no less real. She had given up things. She had stayed. She had told herself for decades that she would be compensated, and she had probably told Evelyn in various careful ways that she expected to be. What Patricia had not accounted for was that my grandmother was not sentimental about obligation. Evelyn believed in what she called earned intimacy, which is different from proximity. You could live 5 minutes away and be a stranger to someone. You could live 3 hours away and be their closest companion if you showed up with your whole self when you came. I had always shown up with my whole self. Even through my 20s, when I was busy and stressed and building a career, I came to the cottage at least 6 times a year, and I stayed for days at a time, not hours. And I sat with her in the evenings and let her talk, and I listened properly, not just waited for a pause to start talking about myself. I know how that sounds. I am not saying it to make myself look good. I am saying it because it explains what happened and what Evelyn chose and why Patricia could not accept it. My grandmother was diagnosed with a form of lymphoma in early spring, 2 years ago. It was not the most aggressive form, but it was progressing, and the doctors were honest with her about what the next 18 months would likely involve. Evelyn was 81 and entirely clear-eyed about mortality. She had been, I think, since my grandfather died. And so she received this news with the kind of equanimity that most people spend entire spiritual lives trying to achieve. She reorganized her affairs. She updated her will with her solicitor, a soft-spoken man named Robert Ashby, who had handled her legal matters for 20 years. She made specific arrangements about the cottage, about her personal possessions, about several charitable bequests she had been planning for years. She did all of this without telling any of us precisely what she had decided. This was deliberate. Evelyn had watched enough family money cause enough damage to know that the safest will is the one no one has time to challenge before it is read. I visited her more frequently once I understood how ill she was. I drove down from London on alternate weekends, sometimes more often. I learned to cook the dishes she could still eat when her appetite narrowed. I sat on her bed and read to her when she was too tired to hold a book herself. I helped her sort through the spare room, which had accumulated 60 years of correspondence, photographs, and objects that needed to be given destinations before she was gone. I did none of this with any thought about the will. I am not asking for credit. I am simply explaining what those months were like, because they were among the most important months of my life, and because what happened afterward tried very hard to poison them, and I refused to let that happen. Patricia began visiting more frequently about 4 months before Evelyn died. This was not surprising in itself. Her mother was visibly failing, and of course she wanted to be present. But there was something in the quality of her visiting that felt different to me in ways I struggled to articulate. She arrived at the cottage with a particular briskness, a businesslike energy that felt at odds with the quiet pace Evelyn preferred in those weeks. She asked questions, not about how Evelyn was feeling or what she needed, but about things, where the china cabinet key was kept, whether the silver was still in the dining room, what had happened to certain pieces of jewelry that had belonged to Evelyn's own mother. She asked these questions in the cheerful, offhand tone of someone who is not asking them seriously, which is the tone people use when they are asking them very seriously indeed. I noticed the way she opened the bureau in the sitting room while Evelyn was resting and stood looking at the contents for a moment before closing it again. I noticed the way she asked, twice, whether Evelyn had spoken to Robert Ashby recently and seemed dissatisfied with the answer both times. I noticed that after her visits, Evelyn sometimes had a particular quality of tired that was different from the tiredness of illness, a tighter, more effortful tiredness, as though she had spent 2 hours managing something rather than simply resting. I did not say anything to Evelyn about this. I did not want to add to her burden, and I told myself honestly and repeatedly that I was probably projecting, that grief makes people behave strangely, that Patricia was allowed to ask questions about her mother's house, that I had no right to police someone's relationship with their own dying parent. I told myself all of this. I mostly believed it, And then, about 6 weeks before Evelyn died, I came downstairs earlier than expected one morning and found Patricia standing at the small writing desk in the study, holding a document. She startled when she heard me. She put the document down, or almost put it down. She half-folded it first, a quick instinctive motion that told me everything I needed to know about her level of comfort with what she had been doing. And she smiled at me in a way that used every muscle required for smiling and none of the ones that would have made it look natural. "Morning," she said. "I was just looking for a pen." The document on the desk was not a pen. I could see that it had been printed on headed paper, though I could not read the text from where I was standing. Patricia moved away from the desk with the particular casual speed of someone trying not to appear to be moving away from something, and asked if I wanted tea, and I said yes, and we went to the kitchen and she made it and we drank it and we talked about Evelyn's appointment that afternoon, and the whole time I could feel the shape of what I had seen pressing against the inside of my chest, like a held breath. I went back to the study after Patricia left for the pharmacy. The document was gone. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, standing at the empty desk where the document had been. I felt cold, not dramatically cold, not the cold of horror films where breath mists and fingers go numb, just the ordinary creeping cold of a suspicion you have been trying not to have finally presenting itself as something you can no longer refuse. I sat down in my grandmother's chair, which smelled of the lavender water she had used for 60 years, and I looked at the closed drawers of the desk, and I thought about whether I should open them. And I did not, because I was still telling myself that I might be wrong, because I was still hoping I was wrong, because Evelyn was dying and the last thing I wanted to spend her final weeks doing was turning her home into a crime scene. 3 weeks later, I found the envelope. It was an accident, genuinely. I was looking for an extra blanket for Evelyn's bed. It was late October by then, and the cottage had a way of going cold quickly in the evenings, no matter how high the heating was set. And I was checking the airing cupboard at the top of the stairs, pulling out blankets and linen, and an envelope fell from between 2 folded sheets onto the floor at my feet. It was addressed to Evelyn in Patricia's handwriting. It was already open. I should not have read it. I read it. It was a letter. 2 pages, written in Patricia's neat, cramped hand. It opened with expressions of love and concern that might have seemed genuine on their own, but felt in context like the opening arguments of a brief. It then proceeded to explain in careful, patient, reasonable language that the cottage should by rights pass to Patricia upon Evelyn's death, because Patricia had been the one to remain close, to provide care and support, to sacrifice proximity to her own family over the years, and because, and here the language shifted into something harder, less patient, because the alternative would be unfair in a way that would require Patricia to take legal advice. That phrase, require Patricia to take legal advice. Not a threat, technically, a statement of inevitability. The letter closed with more expressions of love. My hands were not shaking when I finished reading. They went very still, the way hands sometimes do when the body understands something the mind is still catching up to. I stood there in the upstairs hallway with the letter in my hands, and I listened to the house. I could hear the faint sound of the television Evelyn had started leaving on for company in the evenings. I could hear the wind in the eaves. I could hear my own breathing, which was slower than it should have been and steadier, and I recognized the steadiness as the particular steadiness that comes when something you have been afraid of has finally happened and is therefore no longer frightening in the same way. It has become a problem instead of a fear, and problems can be addressed. I put the letter back in the envelope. I put the envelope back between the sheets. I took the extra blanket to Evelyn's room. I tucked it around her legs and kissed her forehead, and she patted my hand and said she was glad I was there. And I sat with her until she fell asleep, and then I drove back to London, and I did not sleep at all that night. That night in my flat, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold untouched, and I tried to think clearly. I had a letter. The letter was suggestive but not conclusive. Patricia had written to Evelyn expressing what she believed she deserved, and that was unpleasant but not necessarily criminal. The document I had seen in the study was gone, and I had no idea what it was. My grandmother was dying. These were the facts. The question was what to do with them. I thought about calling my mother. She and Patricia had not spoken properly in 2 years, and she would have been sympathetic, but I did not trust her with this. Not because she was untrustworthy, but because her response would have been large and immediate and would have introduced chaos into a situation that needed careful handling. I thought about calling Robert Ashby directly and asking him to confirm that the will was secure. I thought about confronting Patricia. I thought about all of these options and discarded each of them in turn. And eventually, I understood that what I actually needed to do was go back to the cottage, spend as much time there as possible in the weeks remaining, and simply be present. Bear witness. Not as a guardian of property. I want to be honest about the fact that I was aware of my own potential bias, aware that I, too, stood to benefit from my grandmother's will, and aware that this made me an imperfect judge of the situation. But as a person who loved Evelyn and who was not going to look away from what was happening while pretending she had not seen it. Evelyn died on a Thursday morning in November, very quietly with me on one side of her bed and the night nurse on the other. It was not dramatic. She simply stopped, the way a clock stops, all at once and completely, and the room was full of the gray morning light that comes off the downs in autumn, and the smell of her lavender water, and the distant sound of the lane outside the window. And I stayed there for a long time after, holding her hand, which was still warm and felt just like itself. Patricia arrived 2 hours later. I had called her, of course. She came in, embraced me, wept briefly, and then began making phone calls. She was very efficient. I watched her and said little and helped where I was asked to help. And the day passed, and the next day passed, and the week of arrangements passed, and I was so submerged in grief that there was genuinely little room for anything else. The suspicion was still there. It was present every time Patricia appeared at the cottage with her brisk, organizing energy. But grief has a gravity of its own, and for those first weeks it pulled everything else down into itself. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after Evelyn's funeral, at Robert Ashby's office in the village. Patricia arrived before me and had already taken the chair closest to Ashby's desk by the time I came in. Her daughter, Karen, was with her, a thin, precise woman in her late 30s who worked in corporate finance and had the careful, assessing quality of someone who has spent her career identifying vulnerabilities. My mother was there, seated near the window, and she gave me a small nod that contained several years of complicated feeling compressed into a single gesture. There was also a man I did not recognize, who introduced himself as Patricia's solicitor, which struck me immediately as unusual. People did not generally bring their own lawyers to a will reading unless they expected to need one. Robert Ashby greeted each of us with the measured warmth of a man who has spent a long career presiding over the worst moments of families and has learned that a certain professional gentleness is the most useful thing he can offer. He poured water. He arranged his papers. He waited while we settled into our chairs, and I noticed that the settling took longer than it should have. Patricia was whispering something to her solicitor, a compact, sharp-featured man named Gerald Holt, whose business card I had watched him press into her hand with the particular urgency of someone handing over a weapon before a fight. The room itself was very quiet. It smelled of old wood and printer ink and the faint, sweet undercurrent of someone's perfume. Patricia's, I realized, a heavy floral scent that she had worn for as long as I could remember, and that I had always privately associated with formality, with occasions that required a performance. A clock on the mantelpiece ticked with a slow, deliberate patience. Outside the single-sash window, the village went about its Saturday morning. A dog barked twice and was silent. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Ashby began by confirming the standard procedural details. the date, the nature of the document, the identity of the deceased. He spoke about Evelyn with a genuine, brief warmth that made my throat tighten in a way I had not anticipated, and I looked at my hands for a moment until it passed. Patricia sat very straight in her chair, her expression composed into something between grief and expectation, the particular face of a person who believes they are about to receive good news and wants to appear appropriately solemn about it. He began reading. The charitable bequests came first. A local hospice, the village primary school, a wildlife trust Evelyn had supported for 30 years. These were significant amounts, and I watched Patricia's expression as each one was read, and I watched it not change in the way it should have changed if her interest in the proceedings had been purely emotional. Then Ashby read the section concerning personal possessions. Specific pieces of jewelry allocated to specific people, the china to my mother, the books to a friend in the village, the gardening tools. And here, his voice paused for just a moment, a small technical pause, while he found his place. And in that pause, Patricia made a tiny, involuntary sound, a soft exhalation of impatience so brief and so quickly suppressed that I think only I was positioned to hear it. Then he came to the cottage. Evelyn had left the cottage, and the entirety of its contents and the land attached to it, to me. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Patricia said very quietly, "I see." And then she said nothing for another 10 seconds, during which Gerald Holt leaned toward her and murmured something, and she nodded once, and she straightened still further in her chair, and when she spoke again, her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. Flat, metallic, absolutely emptied of the warmth it usually carried, even false warmth. "Robert," she said, "before we proceed, I need to raise a serious concern." Ashby looked at her. He said nothing, which I took as an invitation. "It is my belief," Patricia said, "that this document does not reflect my mother's true wishes. It is my belief that my niece," and here she turned to look at me, and her eyes were not angry in the ordinary way, they were something colder and more considered, exercised undue influence over my mother during a period of illness and vulnerability. It is also my belief that certain earlier documents, which reflected a more equitable distribution of my mother's estate, have been suppressed or interfered with. I felt the words land on me the way cold water lands, all at once, covering everything, taking the breath. I heard my mother make a sharp sound from the window. I heard Karen shift in her chair. I did not look away from Patricia. I kept my eyes on her face, and I kept my breathing even, and I did not speak because I had the instinct, somewhere beneath the shock, that speaking immediately was not what this moment required. "I'm accusing my niece," Patricia said directly to Ashby now, her voice gaining a terrible steadiness, "of manipulating a dying woman, of inserting herself into my mother's life in the final months specifically to engineer this outcome, of forging or influencing documents. I am prepared to contest this will, and Gerald is here today to advise me on the process." Gerald Holt nodded, his expression carefully neutral, the expression of a professional who is paid to be neutral and nothing else. My mother stood up from her chair by the window. "Patricia," she said, "you cannot seriously—" "I can," Patricia said, "and I do." The clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady ticking. I looked at Gerald Holt, and I looked at Patricia, and I looked at Karen, who was staring at the table with an expression I found difficult to read. Not quite conviction, not quite discomfort, something that lived unhappily between the two. And then I looked at Robert Ashby, who'd been sitting very still throughout this exchange, his hands folded over his papers, his face wearing the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and who has now seen it arrive. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, addressing Patricia with careful precision, "I'm grateful that you've raised these concerns in this context because it gives me the opportunity to address them before they proceed any further. Your mother anticipated that concerns of this nature might be raised. She was, as I'm sure you know, a very thorough woman." He paused. He reached into the briefcase beside his desk and produced a small black device, a USB drive, and he set it on the desk in front of him. "Before we proceed with the reading, there is something your mother asked me to share with everyone present. She was quite specific about the circumstances under which it should be shown. She said, if anyone in that room accuses Clara of wrongdoing, show them the drive. Those were her exact words." The room went absolutely still. Patricia said, "What is that?" "Your mother installed a camera in her study approximately 6 months before her death," Ashby said, his voice entirely level. "She was aware that certain items in her home had been disturbed. She was aware that certain documents had been accessed without her knowledge. She took steps to document what was occurring. She provided this drive to me at our last meeting together, along with written instructions about its use." He looked at Patricia with a steadiness that contained no accusation and no satisfaction, just the plain weight of fact. "I have reviewed the contents of the drive. I believe you will find it clarifying." Patricia did not move for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "My mother would not have—" "She did," Ashby said. He connected the drive to the laptop on his desk. He turned the screen so that we could all see it, and he pressed play. What followed was 23 minutes of footage across 4 separate clips. The camera had been positioned in the upper corner of the study, angled to cover the writing desk and the filing cabinet and the door, and the image quality was sharp enough to be unambiguous. The first clip showed Patricia at the writing desk on a Tuesday afternoon 3 months before Evelyn died, going through the contents of the top drawer systematically and photographing several documents with her phone. She was methodical and unhurried, which suggested she had been doing this for some time and had no reason to expect to be observed. The second clip showed Patricia at the filing cabinet, removing a folder, leafing through it, removing 2 pages, folding them, and placing them in her handbag. The third clip was harder to watch. It was Evelyn herself, sitting at her desk alone after Patricia had left, holding the folder and looking at the 2 gaps where the pages had been, and her face had an expression I had not seen on her before and cannot quite describe. Not betrayal exactly, because I think she had already passed through betrayal by then and come out the other side into something quieter and sadder and more final. She simply looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with her illness. The fourth clip showed Karen, who had come alone one weekend while I was back in London, who had sat with Evelyn for 2 hours, and during which time Evelyn had apparently asked to rest, and Karen had said of course, and had then spent 35 minutes in the study. The clip showed her finding a document at the back of the bottom drawer, reading it with great attention, photographing it multiple times, and then, and this is the detail that made my mother press her hand over her mouth from across the room, replacing it with a different document that she had brought with her in a folder of her own. A different document, brought from outside, pre-prepared, placed in the file to be discovered later. I looked at Patricia. Her face had gone through several things very quickly and had arrived at a kind of fixed blankness, the face of a person whose mind is working extremely hard beneath a surface it is trying to keep still. Karen was staring at the laptop screen with an expression that had passed entirely through discomfort and into something much closer to horror. Gerald Holt was looking at the ceiling. "The document Karen replaced," Ashby said, closing the laptop, "was what appears to be a draft power of attorney, pre-signed, dated to a period when your mother was already unwell. I have had it examined. The signature is not your mother's. I have already been in contact with the police." Those 4 words landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Already been in contact with the police. Not a threat. Already done. Patricia turned to me. For a long moment she simply looked at me and I looked back, and I thought about all the things I could say, all the things I had been rehearsing, without knowing I was rehearsing them through the months since I had found the letter in the airing cupboard and I said none of them. Because in the end, there was really only one thing worth saying, and I said it very quietly. She knew, I told Patricia. She knew the entire time, and she loved you anyway. That's what I can't forgive. Not what you tried to take from me, but what you took from her. The last months of her life when she should have been at peace. She spent them watching her own daughter and granddaughter plan this. And she said nothing to me because she didn't want to burden me, and she documented everything because she knew that was the only way it would ever stop. She did all of that alone, and you let her. Patricia said nothing. Her jaw worked once, twice. Her eyes were bright, but I cannot tell you whether with tears or with something else, and I found that I did not particularly want to know. Karen had put her face in her hands. Gerald Holt was already gathering his papers with the focused efficiency of a man calculating the fastest route to the exit. My mother came to stand beside me, and she put her hand on my arm, and she said nothing, and neither did I, and we stood together in the quiet office while the clock ticked on. The police investigation moved in the deliberate, unglamorous way that real investigations move. Through weeks of statements and evidence reviews and meetings with solicitors and the particular administrative exhaustion of watching a legal process unfold at its own pace rather than yours. Patricia and Karen were both interviewed under caution. The document Karen had placed in the filing cabinet was confirmed as a forgery. The signature a copy of Evelyn's handwriting, the dating inconsistent with paper stock analysis. A second investigation established that 2 items of jewelry had been removed from the cottage during one of Patricia's visits and had not been returned. Patricia's solicitor, Gerald Holt, withdrew from the matter almost immediately, citing a conflict of interest, which in practice meant that he had reviewed the evidence and understood which direction the current was running. I did not attend any of the subsequent proceedings in person. I had given my statements, I had provided what I had. The letter from the airing cupboard, the timeline of visits I had documented in my diary, my recollections of the morning I had found Patricia at the desk, and I had allowed the process to take over. My own solicitor, a woman named Helen Marsh, whom my mother's friend had recommended, and who turned out to be precisely as formidable as her reputation, handled the formal defense of the will with a brisk efficiency that left no room for the kind of prolonged legal battle Patricia had presumably planned on. The camera footage made every argument Patricia's team had prepared essentially unusable. You cannot claim someone manipulated a dying woman when you have 35 minutes of your own daughter placing forged documents in that woman's filing cabinet, recorded in high definition by the woman herself. Patricia did not go to prison, which I want to record plainly because I think the truth of what happened matters more than a tidier narrative. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the case and determined that the available evidence, while clearly demonstrating dishonesty and a conspiracy to defraud, presented complexities of proof that made a criminal prosecution uncertain. There were civil proceedings instead. The fraudulent documents were formally voided, the jewelry was returned, and Patricia agreed to a settlement that involved a financial payment to the estate and a formal acknowledgement that the will stood as written. This was, my solicitor told me, a good outcome. I understood what she meant. I felt about it something more complicated than satisfaction and less straightforward than relief. I moved into the cottage in February. I drove down from London with my car full of boxes, and I parked on the lane outside, and I sat for a moment before I got out, looking at the south wall and the bare winter roses. They were not much to look at in February, just brown canes and thorns, stark against the old stone. But I knew what they would be in June. I knew what they had always been, what they would continue to be, tended by the right hands. I got out of the car. I unlocked the front door. Inside, the cottage smelled of cold and lavender and old wood, the smell it had always had, the smell I had been breathing since I was 9 years old with my suitcase and my anxiety and my need for somewhere to land. I walked through every room. I touched things as I went. The back of her chair, the rim of her favorite mug still on its hook, the edge of the writing desk where I had once stood and felt the cold creep into my hands. I stood in the study for a long time. The camera was still there, in the corner of the ceiling where Ashby had pointed it out to me the week before. A small black disc the size of a 10-pence piece. Evelyn had fitted it herself, apparently, with a small stepladder and rather more presence of mind than most 81-year-old women would have brought to the task. I did not take it down. I left it exactly where she had put it. It is May now, and the roses are beginning. The first buds appeared 2 weeks ago, small and tight and very green, and every morning I take my coffee outside and stand on the path and check on them the way she used to, the way she showed me, looking for the particular curl of new growth that tells you the plant is healthy and moving in the right direction. She planted them for him. She tended them to keep talking to him. I tend them now to keep talking to her. I still think about that fourth clip sometimes. Not the footage of Karen in the folder, but the brief, earlier moment when Evelyn sat alone at her desk, holding the file with the missing pages and wearing that exhausted, clear-eyed expression. I think about what she knew and how long she had known it and what it cost her to carry it quietly and to document it carefully and to trust that the right person would be in the right room at the right moment when the drive was finally played. She was right to trust that. She was always, in the end, right about the things that mattered. The roses will be extraordinary this year. I can already tell.